Hi, I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. While we all experience negative events, individuals who encounter extremely traumatic incidents might end up with a mental health condition known as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. On the show today, we talk to our panel of experts and try to understand trauma, how it can lead to PTSD, and how individuals can cope and recover. Joining us for this conversation is Finza, Latif, who's a child and adult psychiatrist at Sidra Medicine, Qatar. She joins us from Doha. Also joining us today is Professor DeVoogd, who's a professor of neuroscience at Cornell University. He joins us from New York. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Dr. Finza, Latif, let me take this first question to you. And how do we understand this condition? Just give us a general summary of what it means.
Yeah, and so in very simple terms, post-traumatic stress disorder is a psychiatric condition where the individual has experienced a significantly traumatic event that created a lot of fear for them. And then it leads to a whole set of different types of symptoms, and you may have a constellation of those symptoms, not all of them. The key ones include avoiding any memory or anything that reminds you of the trauma. So you might avoid the place where you experienced the traumatic event. And then you have other issues related to your mood. You might experience low mood. You might become more irritable. You might have trouble sleeping. You might look at your life differently and have a more hopeless sense of the future because of what has happened. And again, you may some of these things may be characterized by difficulty with sleep, including nightmares. And then the other key term that we often hear about when we hear about post-traumatic stress disorder is flashbacks, which can take the form of re-experiencing the traumatic event, whether in the form of memories or actually physically experiencing the event again.
Dr. Latif, as you tell us what PTSD is, you do mention significant trauma. Now, I want to dig a little deeper into the definition of trauma and whether it's relative for different individuals. How do we define it? Is there a standard for what is traumatic?
Yeah, so trauma as a term can imply both physical and psychological trauma. And as you said, I think you're hinting at a very important aspect of trauma. So it's not just the event that was traumatic, but it's how the individual's experience of the event was that defines the extent of the trauma. So for example, if I'm in an accident, that experience for me the extent of negativity will be determined by how fearful I felt, how aware I was of what was happening. And also my experience of it will be moderated by my own personality. So if I have a more anxious personality, I may experience it more negatively than somebody who is less anxious and more resilient. So really two factors is your personal factors and your perception of the incident that defines the severity.
Right. They're very helpful ways of trying to understand what this is and how it impacts different individuals differently. And we're going to talk about this in greater detail. But before that, Professor DeVoogd, as we talk about these symptoms, Dr. Latif mentioned how repressing memories is part of it. And I wonder, how much does trauma impact the subconscious mind and parts of our minds and behavior that we have no idea about that are being impacted by this trauma?
We make several different kinds of memory. We make a kind of memory about the facts and experiences that we're having all the time. We also make memories of things that are fearful. And one of the things that happens with PTSD is that the balance between the two shifts. So normally, if we have something bad happen to us, we are scared or upset, as would happen with the video that you're showing on your monitor. But we also think about it. We also find a way to explain it. We also find a way to forget it. And it's that ability to forget it that is one of the things that goes wrong with PTSD.
Right, that ability to forget what happened, and that's why it gets ingrained in your mind. Now, when we're talking about the wider implications of trauma, how much do they impact a person's physical being, as we're talking about the mind being connected to the body entirely?
It's a huge impact. The person is not only experiencing fear in their brain, they're producing the hormones that are associated with stress. And ultimately, those hormones are having an impact on the physiology of the whole body. Those hormones, which are designed to help us get out of an immediate stress, escape a lion. But if you have them all the time, gradually they start to wear down your brain and wear down other organs as well. So it can be very, very debilitating to have PTSD and to live with that stress all the time.
Right. We're going to also about how individuals can identify this condition within themselves, recognize that they are suffering from it, and the community members can also recognize an individual suffering from it so they can help them help themselves. Dr. Finza, Latif, but one of the things that I want to talk a little more about is the impact of trauma on a young individual versus an adult. And you deal with children and you deal with adults in this manner. How long-lasting is the trauma that a child experiences? How does that translate into when they're an adult? And which do you think is more impactful, when they're a child or once they are a fully formed adult?
Right. So again, if comparing the impact of a traumatic event on an adult or a child, it really is less so, well, partly it can be a factor of age, but again, there are a lot of other factors that that determine how bad the effect of the trauma would be. So for example, if you take a child or an adult, what environment they live in really can be important. So if a child lives in a loving, supportive environment and goes through a traumatic event, the impact of that trauma will be much less compared to another child that has lost their parents or lost other loving family members or doesn't have a roof over their head. Those factors will impact the long-term effect of the trauma. And the same thing applies to adults. Now, that said, we talk about adverse child experiences, or ACEs in brief, and the number of adverse childhood experiences that you have can add up. So if you have several different traumatic events, the impact of it will be much more severe and long-lasting and much harder to overcome as an adult, and can affect your long-term functioning as an adult, versus if you're a child and you have a single traumatic event, but you live in a supportive environment, it's much easier to overcome, and it may not have a long-term effect as an adult.
Professor DeVoogd, from a neuroscientist's point of view, and when we're talking about brain development here, when we're trying to connect both of these things, trauma in childhood and how that leads to the development of a child's mind, give us your insight into that.
I would agree with your previous speaker that in children where the brain is still forming, being involved repeatedly in the kinds of experiences that you're showing in your video is just devastating. It's something that lasts a very long time and is very difficult to overcome. It happens in adults too. Before this interview, I was looking up some things and found out that in the United States, the people that participated, that were directly involved in our Vietnam War, roughly 30% of them ultimately showed symptoms of PTSD. And it depends on the individual how easily or how difficult it is to finally get beyond that.
Right. Now you're saying this, and this really reminds me, as you mentioned the Vietnam War here, I'm thinking about the time we're living through right now and what mental health experts and professionals such as yourself say the implications of this will be on the mental health, especially of those individuals who have been on the front lines. Professor DeVoogd, what are your main concerns regarding this, living through this time for how that's going to impact generations that are coming, and especially individuals who've been on the front lines?
I think it's going to be very, very hard. We've seen that in the U.S., and I expect you have in Pakistan as well, that people who are working 18-hour days and ultimately don't have ways of really helping the people with the COVID disease, ultimately show these PTSD symptoms. Or to flip it around, if you have support from your community, both your health community and your family, it makes it easier to get through this.
Right. Now, Dr. Finza, one of the things is about support is the community recognizing this is in fact a condition and them being able to recognize the symptoms. Now, if you have to speak directly to the viewers and you have to tell them what are the things they need to watch out for or help identify what actually is happening and what we're talking about here today, PTSD, what would those things be, those red flags?
Yeah, so first of all, being aware of the person's life experience is important. So was there a traumatic event? And like, as you mentioned, during the pandemic, even small things like having to be stuck at home, not being able to have your normal life experiences, all together, the fear of getting the infection, the possibility of losing a loved one, that in itself can comprise a traumatic experience. So being mindful that that a traumatic experience doesn't have to be a major accident or major incident. It could just be these small factors that the person experiences. So as a family member, being aware of that. And then if they notice changes in behavior, or if the person is becoming more irritable or cranky, not being their usual self, having more trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, changes in their normal behavior will help the person living with them identify that they might be having a more extended stress reaction than what other people are experiencing.
Right. Dr. Latif mentioned the word awareness here. One thing that does come to my mind is, can it be possible that an individual has all these symptoms, but they're not aware of which event precisely caused them to experience all of this?
It's certainly possible. We mentioned, repressing memories or avoiding thinking about the incident. So it's also possible that the person is having these symptoms but not connecting it to that incident that they'd rather not think about. And or it could be a series of events throughout their life that have accumulated and caused that stress response that they're experiencing now.
Professor DeVoogd, as Dr. Latif talks about this repression of memories, and we've talked about this quite a lot right now as well, but how does that impact a person's behavior when they have repressed memories? Is there noticeable changes in their behavior? What is that feeling like?
Yes, certainly, because they are always trying to avoid anything that will remind them of the difficult events. And so in the example I gave before, people coming back from the Vietnam War, they don't want to be anywhere near loud noises. They don't want to be by groups of people. They don't want to be where there's lots of activity, because each of those kinds of things, even without realizing it, can remind them of the awful circumstance that they were in.
Right, so it definitely does have a long-lasting impact on a person's behavior. Dr. Finza Latif, now when we're going towards solutions and how individuals can cope with this, what are some of the ways that they can reach out to professionals or help themselves, basically? Reaching out to professionals must be one of the ways they can help in doing that. But what are some of the things that they need to be on the lookout for?
So I would say, first of all, if we're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, that's a very serious psychiatric condition. And I don't think anybody should be expected to cope with it themselves or figure out solutions for themselves. So certainly seeking professional help is the most important. And there are a few different types of therapies that have shown to be very effective for PTSD, including trauma-based cognitive behavior therapy. There is another type of therapy called EMDR that helps you relive some of those memories and decrease your traumatic response towards those memories. So those are the actual effective treatments. As far as what the individual can do, I think really recognizing that this is impacting their life and seeking the help and not falling victim to stigma of seeking mental health treatment or thinking that they can just get over it themselves.
Right, so when talking about treatment, it's important to ask this question. When they're seeking this treatment, can individuals be expected to overcome this? Is it possible to overcome PTSD?
It is a very severe and a very chronic illness, and it is one of the illnesses that can be very treatment resistant. However, that's not to say that you cannot overcome it. And again, some of the factors, your environmental factors and your personality factors will define the prognosis, whether you are going to get better or not. So if you're an individual who's not had multiple traumatic experiences and is a resilient person with good self-worth and good insight, then it is certainly possible to get better and not allow the symptoms to impact your life.
Right. We've been talking about individuals and how they need to focus on this as well, but there's a new branch of research that talks about intergenerational trauma, how that's impacted. I'm going to take this to Professor DeVoogd first and talk to him about this. When we try to understand these things, trauma, depression, anxiety, how can they pass on from generation to generation?
The most obvious way is that parents who have experienced a traumatic event then are fearful in their lives. And children, of course, learn from their parents. And so children learn that life is scary, that they should always be cautious, that they should always be aware of things that could be going wrong. And that attitude then is something that the children pick up and carry with them in life. There is also recent research suggesting a more direct effect where under severe stress, under severe trauma, it's even possible for genetics to change in the parent in a way that directly affects the development of babies and children.
Right, and I want to talk a little more about these genetics. If a person, for instance, has a positive outlook on life, if they're trying to do everything right, but it is, as you're saying, being passed on to their genetics, how much more difficult does it become for them to resist this or seek treatment for it?
As your other guest says, for cases that are severe, it's not something you can just fix in yourself. And depending on your own experience, depending on the culture that you're in, it may be difficult for you to realize that you need to find professional help. And the professional help at best probably should consist both of the kinds of therapies that she was mentioning and some kind of drug treatment that goes with it at the same time. But for severe PTSD, you cannot fix it yourself.
Right. Dr. Finza, Latif, you as an expert, when you're dealing with these things, is there a difference between a person, as Professor DeVoogd stated for us, who's been conditioned to have this because of a family environment, and someone who might have gotten this stress or depression-related illnesses because of their genetics? Is there a difference in how you treat them?
There is no difference in how we would treat them. First of all, it would be also very hard to differentiate between the two, because any person with post-traumatic stress disorder would most likely have environmental factors as well as the possibly the genetic factors which impact how they respond to the stress. And I think what your other guest was mentioning as far as activation of genes, even that is an interplay between your environment that you live in and your genes. So this is having basically is experiencing traumatic events that activate certain genes that you inherited, that if you didn't have that traumatic event would not have been active for the rest of your life, and you wouldn't have had an impact of them. So it's all really intertwined. So there's really no difference in an individual of treating those two things separately.
And not treating those separately, and also when we're talking about children and family environments, do you think it's helpful if a family or a certain individual in the family has experienced a traumatic event and the whole family as a comes to you or comes to a professional to try to seek help with their dynamics, do you think that's more helpful than an individual seeking help?
Absolutely. So this definitely applies to children and adolescents because they don't live in a bubble. They do live in a family environment. And your parents' response to a traumatic incident actually also defines how well you're going to do in treatment if you're a child. So we always include families and we assess how the mother and the father are handling the stress, if this is a stressor that's impacting the entire family, and teach them ways on how to, whether they need to seek separate treatment or we can help them build skills that they can then use to help their child.
Right. I'm going to end this conversation, Dr. Finza, Latif, and Professor Tim DeVoogd, by talking about something you both mentioned, which is community support, family support, how important that is. You both as professionals, by being able to see this up much closer and with much more clarity than a regular person, what do you think needs to happen to make those support systems, especially professional support systems, more accessible for individuals? Dr. Finza, Latif, give us some insight into that.
So, healthcare access is more of a policy issue and what's available for the families. As a community, I think the best that we can do is try individually to overcome this general stigma that comes with having a mental illness in general and seeking treatment. In my mind, that's a big roadblock for families to actually seek professional help. And as a community, if we understand that these psychiatric illnesses are just like other medical illnesses, you wouldn't hesitate to go to a doctor to get antibiotics. Why would you hesitate to come to a psychiatrist to get help for PTSD? Right. So I think that just changing our thinking in that manner can really help.
And that's very, very important advice there, trying to remove the stigma that's attached to mental health issues, and especially something like this, which can, of course, be linked to several factors. Professor Tim DeVoogd, same question there. What changes do you think we need to make, especially as we talked about this pandemic going on and after effects that everyone's expecting will happen? What are some of the things that you think societies need to change in order to deal and tackle with these issues better?
I'd agree with Dr. Latif, first of all. But secondly, I guess I'd like to emphasize for your viewers to not dismiss this, to not say, well, snap out of it. I would like for your listeners to go away with knowing that this is a very real and very serious condition. And just one small example, a graduate of my university, a doctor who was treating patients in New York City, committed suicide because she couldn't cope anymore with how many sick people she was seeing and how little she could do for them. And so if we could both know that it's real and serious and know that family and community support makes a difference, I think it would be very important.
Right, and that's so important to understand that how serious this can be and not trying to understate the implications of it. Thank you so much, Dr. Finza Latif, for joining us from Doha, Professor Tim DeVoogd for joining us from New York. We're going to go for a short break, but when we come back, we take a look at how our society's perception of happiness is changing. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. Now, happiness is a rather obscure emotion, and feeling this joy is often seen to be dependent on various factors, which means that the experience of it can be very relative. But when so much of our culture emphasizes on happiness being the ultimate goal, it's important to have a more concrete discussion about it. Today on the show, we talk more about how we can understand the idea of happiness and can we achieve it through bringing changes in the way we think. Let's discuss this further. Joining us for this conversation today is Professor Samina Yasmeen, who's a teacher and researcher at the University of Western Australia School of Social Sciences and the director and founder of the University Centre for Muslim States and Societies. She joins us from Perth. Also joining us today is Professor Alison Scott-Baumann, who's a professor of society and belief at the Centre of Islamic Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies. She joins us from London. Thank you both for joining us and a very, very warm welcome to the show today. Professor Alison Scott-Baumann, let me begin with you. Now, when we talk about happiness and how society is engaging with it, do you see that engagement evolving or changing in recent years?
Meshal, I think that's a very, very good question, because I think in a way, I mean, I'm 70 now, so I've seen a lot of happiness come and go. I think in a way, we're going backwards because our aspirations are becoming less realistic. So in my academic work, I see that happiness is not a product. It's not an object. It's actually a state of mind that we have to aspire to, very difficult to achieve. Sometimes it happens accidentally, like being with my grandchildren. But it's definitely something which necessitates us accepting the negative along with the positive. So that means that when we project our negativity into others, we're giving up. We're giving up the possibility of happiness.
Giving up the quality of happiness, that's a very strong statement, and it gives us a lot more to talk about. Professor Samina, Yasmeen, as we're talking about this, and we're talking about how Professor Baumann put it, that it's not a product or a commodity, do you think happiness is being commodified, though?
Oh, definitely. I think, one, there's a new trend, which at least we can notice in the last 10 to 15 years, that everyone has to be happy. So if you're not happy, there's a problem. And then because there's so much consumerism, now then happiness has been connected to what you own, what you can have, and not after working for it, but instantaneously. So happiness has been commodified, but it's also been linked to commodities that you need to have. And I think that's created a lot of problem, because as you start defining yourself and your happiness in terms of what you own, physical objects, you can actually spend more than what you have, and that contributes to pressure, which contributes to unhappiness.
Right, that rat race referred to is in fact causing to the unhappiness. Professor Alison, Scott-Baumann, do you agree with that as well? Do you think that the commodification of happiness is in fact causing too many hurdles for us to actually achieve it?
I think that's true. And I think it's also fair to say that the way we understand our relationships with other people is being seriously eroded by the internet. So although it's amazing, it's fantastic, I use it all the time, but the way people communicate on social media means that in a way, people are now deciding how offensive they find somebody else to be, rather than how interesting they find somebody else to be. So again, it's this negativity. We impose negative, our own negative emotions onto other people and then accuse them of damaging us. So I think the idea is that we should accept the negativity within us, and then we will be able to achieve maybe more modest aspirations for happiness, but more realistic ones.
Right. Now, this connectivity that you talk about, the one that, of course, exists with us 24/7 on our phones, on our laptops, when we're connected to social media. Social media is presented as a very happy place, a place where conversation flourishes, a place where you can have discussions with opposing viewpoints. But talking about how it is becoming a source of unhappiness, why do you think exactly that is? Do you think it's the way arguments are presented there, or the way engagement occurs?
There are several factors. One is that the algorithms are created to encourage strife. So if there's something about a bad sex attack, or something about an explosion, something about violence, these are augmented and enhanced by the algorithm so that those stories travel faster and are more effectively communicated. I think the other issue is that I could write something rude online and then I could go and make myself a cup of coffee. I've completely dissociated myself from that unpleasantness. Whereas if I were in the same room with somebody, I would not look them in the face and say the things to them that can be put online. So the connectivity is breaking up. We need to be together more. Facing each other as we are now, Meshal, I count that as proper communication. But obviously, if I'm on Twitter or if I'm on my email, I could be rude and take no responsibility for it. And this is why the human fabric is becoming weakened.
Right. Professor Samina, Yasmeen, as we talk about the internet, it's important to note how many studies have come out linking depression and anxiety to social media there. But you as a social scientist, when you see how our discourse has evolved, how important of a tool social media has become, given the cost of it, do you think we can give it up as not just individuals, but a society which relies very, very heavily on these modes of communication?
I think at one level we can't put the genie that's already out of the bottle. We are connected to it, and in fact in the COVID-19 age, when we can't at times be able to work or go to our workplaces, we are relying on technology, social media. So in that sense, it's got positives as well. But where the negativity comes in and where I think it's going to be hard is that what Alison is talking about is that we've got used to what I think of as unidimensional relationships. We have a relationship which is only goes that far and not really deeper. And in that, at one level, we become hooked. I don't know whether you do that or not, but I constantly have to check myself that if I'm sitting, while in the past I'll be reading a book, I pick up my mobile. Now, if I'm doing that, a young person whose life started when all these things were just part of being normal, I think their addiction or their reliance on that is too great. So in that context, if we suddenly remove it, for whatever reason, I think it's going to contribute to a lot of unhappiness, because you might have read those stories where young people, when they've been denied access to social media, some of them have tried to kill themselves. I think because of this extreme dependence on social media as a way of connecting to people, even though I say it's a unidimensional connection, I think that creates problems, but it also creates dependence. And that gives us a false sense of being in a group, but not really happy. But if you take it away, the level of unhappiness, I think, would be greater than what we might find now.
Right. Professor Alison, Scott-Baumann, I'm going to shift gears here and talk a little about how we approach this topic. Now, you having expertise on society and belief and talking about how society works and how individuals perceive several beliefs. When we're talking about happiness, as I mentioned in my introduction, it is a very, very obscure emotion and it's very relative. And there seems to be very, very few ways of talking about it in a concrete manner, even though we all agree that for each and every individual, it's seen to be the ultimate goal, happiness. Why do you think that is? What do you think prevents us from writing about it in a concrete manner, about having discussions about it in a concrete manner?
Yeah, that's another very good question, Meshal. I think my research would suggest that all that you say is true. It's extremely difficult to capture this idea. But for me, the way forward would be to develop improved democracies so that deliberative democracy becomes a shared effort. If we want happiness, we can find it in the well-being of others, and we can find it in our ability to compromise. So I'm introducing at university level the opportunity for students to converse more openly with each other about difficult matters. This is becoming less current because people, as we've agreed, hurl abuse at each other online, but they don't actually sit down to talk sensibly about difficult things.
Right.
I think that leads to the best kind of compromise towards happiness that we can have, the happiness of others, which we share. And it's difficult because we have to give up something that we desperately want ourselves in order to accommodate other people. Now, this is the opposite of what right-wing populism facilitates. Right-wing populism ensures that we aspire to stuff we can never have. It's like the eternal consumer wet dream. So leaving Europe, for example, it's never been done before that trade deals now have to be made which make Britain's position weaker. That's the opposite of what a trade deal should be. But that proved possible because the government said, just wish for the impossible and we'll make it happen. And obviously that's not possible, but they made people believe that it was possible. That's an example of an unrealistic aspiration to ridiculous levels of happiness.
Right. Professor Yasmeen, on a similar point, when we're having this conversation, I'm reminded of Bell Hook's book, All About Love, and it's something that really fits into this. When we're writing literature, when we read literature, and fiction being one thing, but actual literature focusing on these obscure emotions, why do you think that's been sidelined for so many years, even though they are very, very fundamental emotions and very fundamental aspirations for all of us?
I lost part of what you were saying, but if I've got the gist of that, I think literature has looked at sort of emotions that we can't really touch and be able to identify it clearly. And the way love, happiness is discussed, it's got different colors or different hues. For example, if we talk about Faiz Ahmad Faiz, his poem Bahar Aayi, it actually talks about a certain aspect of suddenly feeling that there's something good. But I think the reality is that if we're talking about happiness and how we approach that, we need to understand that it can't be a perpetual state of happiness. We can't live in that state as human beings. I think Alison Scott-Baumann probably would know more about that, but I just know that humanly it's impossible to be always in a heightened stage of being happy. I think what we need to start revisiting is this notion of ultimate state of sustained happiness. We really need to start thinking about being at peace, more in the nature of being able to attain at least some part of wisdom, some part of comfort, and not just simply for ourselves, but also for others. And I think that's something you will find in literature. It does come through in different ways, but unless and until we start getting in touch with that side of ours, maybe that's where Alison has got sort of complaints or problems with the social media in the way we relate to each other. But I think we have to be in touch with that humane part of ourselves, the part that doesn't require a lot of words, but requires communication. I think once we get to that point, probably even unsustained happiness will be better than the state that we find ourselves in, where we want to be happy all the time and are going out of our way to do things or to accommodate ideas or to accumulate things.
No, you raise a number of very important points. I'm going to put my last question to Professor Alison Scott-Baumann and connect it to what you've stated here. Professor Alison Scott-Baumann, very early on we talked about how the idea of happiness is being commodified and how it's almost commercially manufactured these days. And when we talk about revisiting the idea of sustained happiness or there being certain standards we need to aspire towards, how do you think we can break through all that noise, all that is advertised to us as ways of reaching happiness? How do you think we can break through that?
Well, it's interesting that in Britain, although COVID-19 has brought hardship, it has also brought a great swathe of activity in the home. So people are learning to bake bread, keep bees. It's completely ridiculous. People are doing things they never thought they had any interest in. And that, I think, is an example of the way we need to become more grounded in our own physicality. Because, as I said earlier on, and we agree on this, the social media allows us to believe that we can escape our bodies. We can just exist in a metaphysical sense online. This is the way to deep, deep unhappiness, because it's not true. So I think that being more able to be grounded in physicality and more able, as I said earlier on, to relate to other people at a deep personal level is very important. And we must aspire to improving our lives, but not measuring ourselves by what we've lost, what we lack, and what we long for. Those three things, loss, lack, and longing, are used against us to make us think that we can buy the happiness, buy the object we want. That's rubbish. We have a lot in our favor. Even those of us who are deeply unhappy have a lot to celebrate, and then we can also try to move forward.
Right, on that point, thank you so much, Professor Alison Scott-Baumann, for joining us from London, Professor Samina Yasmeen for joining us from Perth. Thank you so much for tuning into our conversation. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.